Today we have the first of a series of keynote lectures that will take place the whole of this week, which are connected with the final reviews of our 5 March programs of the graduate school, the AA. Today we have José Castillo, who spent the day with us as one of the members of the jury, assessing the work of students from housing and urbanism, giving the evening lecture on the subject of a city is not a house. It gives me always great pleasure to welcome Castillo back at the AA. It was not that long, if I remember well, I think it was 2012. José was here for a symposium we had on design and political engagement in the informal city, when he did a fascinating presentation, including several recent projects of his office, and we very much hope that he will update us and consider that very interesting debate and discussion about questions of housing and urbanism. José is an architect, a Mexican architect, trained at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, also at the Graduate School of Design in Harvard, and in fact is now a professor in both universities. And in fact, he was about to leave Mexico to go to Boston, and we managed to convince him to do a detour and go to Boston via London, and that's how we know we're very lucky to have him here today. José is also a visiting lecturer in many other American universities, European universities. He's in the advisory board of the program Cities at the London School of Economics and also of Urban Age, organized by the LSE. Has been involved in organization of exhibitions across the world, very actively in Mexico and internationally. He's a practitioner and academic. As a practitioner, he has an architectural office with his wife that has been very, very busy, particularly dealing with projects related to questions of housing in the city, very much connected to this new generation of mass housing policies in Mexico, being involved particularly in the more recent, more exciting changes that are being attempted within the new policies. What I think is interesting for us is that Castillo, both as a practitioner and as an academic, he has done considerable research, he has published extensively. He systematically addressed, both in his professional practice and academically, issues that are at the very core of what housing and urbanism is about. Not least, as I mentioned before, this whole debate on the question of architecture, design, and the informal city, about which José has written extensively and has made some quite important contributions to the international debate on this question of informal urbanism and informal urbanisms, but very much about this question of the articulation of housing and urbanism, how to understand that articulation, very much about questions of housing as urbanism, and how to understand housing as urbanism. And today's talk is exactly about a city is not a house. Okay, but very much in that line of understanding of the articulations of housing with the city. So I welcome José, and after his presentation we'll have some time for questions, comments, and discussion. I know that many of you have been the whole day in the juries of housing and urbanism and are probably quite tired, but I hope you will last the whole run. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for that very generous presentation. I'm going to take out my watch. So I put 45 minutes. I talk quite fast, and then we can proceed to questions. Otherwise, you don't know me, Jorge. I can be like the Fidel Castro of Latin American urbanization. So, but I think, and I mean this seriously when I say that I cannot think of a better place to give this lecture than at the AA, which is a program that actually is very much concerned from its name with this relationship between housing and urbanization, housing and urbanism. And in a way, architecture has been, we have tended to historically collapse the idea that to produce a city is to produce housing. And I like to problematize both through a series of ideas in the first third of the lecture and then through our recent work to actually say and explore what are the gaps between that sense of understanding, both at a theoretical level, at policy level, planning, urban design, but also at the architectural and professional level. If you're familiar with this often misquoted phrase by Alberti that the house is a small city and the city is a big house, I would have to say that the past 500 years have dealt with this issue of urbanism as a problem of scale. And the problem of urbanism is actually of finding the way that the traits of designing a house were present in the city. And the traits that were present in the city could be applied to the house and to the design of the house. In my mind, this is actually quite problematic, and it goes in line with this notion that I've sort of developed over the past few years, which is the kind of the narcissistic idea of the architect. The architect is actually Caravaggio's Narcissus, looking into his own reflection and unable to heed the call from anyone aside. And I would argue that vis-a-vis the city, architecture has been a kind of narcissistic figure, unable to understand that the complexities of the city escape our own professional, theoretical, intellectual capacities. It's not that they escape in a way that they were not actors or even relevant actors in the design of the city, but that we have been gazing too much in our own reflection, unable to understand the complexities of what constitutes cities and what constitutes citizenness different from housing. And clearly, the way that we depict a city is very much entailed in the way that we produce that city. So, if we think that the city is about understanding the gaps between the public and the private, between the way we sort of regulate even something as basic as fiscal taxes, the cadastre, we would be producing certain forms of drawings and certain forms of city-making processes, such as the Noli map. And as we discussed this morning during the reviews, if we conceptualize mid-19th century, the idea that the city is this sort of interactive realm or interactive protocol between the private and the public, the via and entre vias, as Cerdà termed them, we're bound to produce a form of city making which we can then regard as useful or not useful anymore, as relevant or irrelevant anymore. But it goes to this nature that because they're dynamic systems, the way that we imagine the growth of cities is very much entails the possibilities of success or failure of a different city. If you look at the commissioner plans of New York City, this is 1812, or 1807, we would see that a clear decision to see how the city would grow, actually, and we see that something's missing, which is Central Park. The idea that what type of relationship between the growth of a city and its understanding of infrastructure, public space, but also land values, real estate development is at the core of how we figure housing in this equation. And I think that I don't know why this keeps coming up. Sorry. No, actually, no, I'll just do this. Okay, so to think about how we place the question of housing vis-a-vis a city and a nation, one would be tempted to sort of quote the often the cliche of the 2000s, which is the idea that we're now an urban, this will be an urban age, and this will be the century of cities. Actually, for a place like Mexico, we were a century of, the 20th century was the century of our cities. Actually, close to 80% of the population in Mexico live in cities. So the question of how we design policies for cities is at the core of how we imagine housing as well. But in my mind, I've always find problematic that the production of housing in countries like Mexico, but also the production of the idea of the large urban project was connected to the notion of an absence of planning. In other words, when you don't plan, where you don't imagine the future of the city, you produce projects. And I'm not getting into discussion of the project versus the plan, but I would just say that the history of 20th century Mexico City is a history of substituting the plan and even the imagination of housing through the large-scale project. And we see this, and I use the Brazilian Superquadra just in comparison, but this is a series of projects from the CUPA, the Presidente Alemán urban complex by Mario Pani, all the way through to the National University campus. The substitution of planning is taken by the large scale. And of course, you have to understand this in the context of autocratic regimes. Scale and size does matter, and scale and size becomes a substitute for reimagining better engagements with the city. This is 1946, Mario Pani, he gets asked to do 200 units of housing, and he builds 1,000. He builds 1,000 units, drafting another piece of early 20th century avant-garde architecture. And Pani is, of course, emblematic of this transition and this evolution of the understanding of housing, because even, and let me go back, even as complex as one would say that this housing project is, it had all the ground floor was full of services. It had child care facilities and a clinic and a pool. In a way, it was trying to understand how the city could be collapsed into the project of housing. And this idea remains very much for at least 20 years as the core way to understand housing in the city. Probably the last and most dramatic, the high point of this relationship is 1961, 1963, with the production of 13,000 housing units in Tlatelolco. This is emblematic, and this goes back to the issue of Narcissus. To imagine that a single architect in a site of over 100 hectares would produce and design the 13,000 units of housing, not a single architect, an additional architect in the way, with the exception actually of Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, who he invited to build the Ministry of Foreign Relations. But he builds 13,000 housing units, 3 typologies only. So this is, I mean, you can imagine the level of power and the level of the sense of self-fulfillment and importance if you're able to do this. Actually, if you're hired to do this. And this is problematic for a number of reasons, which I will explain in a moment. But this is, I would say, if not the golden age of housing production, it is a moment in which both the political, the social, but also the architectural project of modernity had a fade in its ability to transform the world. It was a moment where both presidents and mayors would actually go cut a ribbon of a new housing project. Architecture had almost like a social relevance, which I would say it's lacking in our days. But at the same time that Pani was doing building Tlatelolco, he was actually thinking that the production of housing from the professional standpoint could stop this. Namely, and he called it the cancer of the city. The cancer of the city was informality. So it's a paradox that the high point of housing production is also the high point of informality. Should I? Okay. Apologies. I don't. So, oops, sorry. So it's kind of a schizophrenia. Gilles Deleuze says in a conversation with Claire Parnet that the more we want to change the world, the better we take it as it is. And Pani was actually in a sort of a utopian, but at the same time naive way, was imagining that to change the world, he had to do without this. And of course, we know the story I've touched upon in my lecture 2 years ago here. I discussed how this process of informality became almost a protocol for city making through its progressive qualities, through its ability to build the 1.5 million community one house at a time, but also through an understanding of flexibility of capital investments, through an understanding of the relationships between housing and urbanism in ways that Pani really did not get. This is more than just an iconography. This is about fragmenting investment. This is about live work. This is about multiple households. This is actually about some of the aspirations that city living meant and still means today, which is about evolving, growing, having plus value for a property. But somehow Pani and the housing discourse of the 60s were unable to understand this. I show this is one of my favorite images of Ciudad Neza, a place where in an unplanned environment, or let's say minimally planned environment, you would have a shop in the ground floor, it's a paint shop, a gym on the second floor, 2 units on the third floor, plus rental units on the fourth floor, plus a Corona advertising on the roofscape. This is in a way the Dutch understanding of density and keep in mind that this was precisely the things that people like Pani were fighting. And of course we know how this story turned out. This is Armin Lincoln's photograph by which Dan Sujic and Ricky Burdett decided to name Mexico City the Endless City. Keeping in mind that after this crisis of in the 60s, the fact that we could not ignore informality, the fact that housing production was not going to solve the problem alone. In 1972, there's a moment in which policy becomes relevant, which is when the Mexican government recognizes that the fight against informality has to be done in a different fashion. And they start a policy called, well, actually they organize an institution called the Infonavit, which is the National Institute for Workers' Housing. Basically, this is a taxation system. It is a system in which there's a kind of like a new social contract in which the state would keep, through a taxation system, 5% of the employees' wages plus 5% of contribution by the employees, keep this in a fund, and they would use that fund for the production of housing. This is not a minor moment, because it actually Congresses may approve laws or may bring down old and irrelevant laws, but for Infonavit, the fact that in these 40 years has been able to have every January 1st the sources to produce more than 500,000 homes, it's actually a unique housing policy in the world. In 1972, they decide to understand that the institution would have a double mandate: housing production, housing finance, and housing production. So Infonavit during the 70s and 80s decides to do this dual task. And they produce actually some, if not amazing, but at least, let's say, if not amazing as some of Pani's early work, at least some very relevant pieces of architecture by some of the most talented architects in the 1970s and 80s. And I show this not necessarily because of their architectural quality, but an understanding of how housing policy could also become a mode of doing urbanism. Again, keep in mind that in the absence of planning, we produce housing. Actually, none of these housing projects is as large as the Tlatelolco project. We never returned to the possibility of 13,000 housing units until the late 1990s, in which I will talk in a second. But the dual mandate meant something, that by 1990, the Institute was in crisis. They were putting too many resources on the construction of housing, but they were not concerned with the fact that most of the mortgages were not getting repaid. So the Institute was very close to disappearing because of default credits. But since housing was understood as a social policy, and that's only, housing became the big umbrella in which no urbanism, just housing, no social policy, just housing. So you don't ask a worker to pay a loan, because at the end of the year he will be voting for your political party, the party that remained in power for 70 years. And if he's a happy worker, we're a happy autocratic regime. And so part of that social pact was sort of played out through housing. But if you see that there was another transition, ideas in Latin America always arrive like 30 years late. So in the same fashion that Pani was copying a piece of Corbus drawings from the 1920s in the 1940s, we were doing zoning in the 1970s and actually doing housing without any additional services. So what actually appeared in some of Pani's projects disappear here. And of course, this is the beginning of the rise of the single-family home. And the Infonavit, in a way, was also trying to pinpoint an understanding of domesticity. And this related to the nuclear family, a family that was 4 individuals, 2 working parents, and 2 children. And therefore, every single house was produced to understand that demography. These are photographs by Ionis Luque, a fantastic young photographer, who's now documenting how those units have sort of a transition over time. But in 1991, with this crisis, President Salinas, who began deregulation and liberalization of economic policies, decides, what should we do? Should we remain a building company and a finance institution, or should we divorce the two? And in 1991, Infonavit stopped building a single unit of housing, and they focused on the finance aspect. This is another crucial moment, because it meant that the social policy would have to be carried out by the developers. So private developers in the early 1990s start growing, and a few other things start happening in the 1990s. After the tequila crisis, 1994, the whole economic bubble, there was a rise in insecurity. This meant that, and this is for those of you who don't understand Spanish, when was the last time you let her out? So you can imagine the poor girl in the window, sort of unable to go out to play in the street. And of course, they're advertising a gated community 20 minutes away from the city. This is the rise of the gated communities. This is the rise of substitution of cityness through the production of private, gated, isolated, detached, peripheral housing. And this is a paradigm that has remained to our days. A paradigm, these are photographs by Livia Corona, another fantastic Mexican photographer. But this is a moment in which large scale begins to play a bigger role again, but also the gated communities. This is like minimum wage housing, but if you look carefully, you'll see that there's some of these, actually there's a gate here. So this is a gated community. It's a big, large, urban, poor gated community. And of course, every one of them with their parking spaces, though less than 5% of the people have a car. So this rise of building housing, again, became the substitute for urbanism. This is actually a real picture, it's not Photoshop, but this shows the dilemma of the late 1990s, the fact that even after 40 years of a fruitless fight against informality, 60% in 1999, 60% of the housing was still produced through this mechanism. Actually, this was a form of urbanism. This was housing alone. And of course, that's the idea that if we understand the city as a house, we're bound to produce models of cityness which will go bankrupt sooner rather than later. And of course, this deals with the issue of the growth of the city. This is a time where the average city grew in population twice, but grew in size 7 times. Some cities in Mexico grew twice in population over the last 20 years, but they extended in size 20 times. What does it mean for resources? What does it mean for sustainability? What does it mean for infrastructure? What does it mean if there's anyone who thinks that? Yeah, you know what? Yeah. Okay. So this substitution, this understanding that we should concern ourselves, and what happens when sort of the finance guides lead urbanization? The success of a city is measured by how many credits you put forward. This is a serious conversation we had last week. The former deputy director of Infonavit was telling us that in 2001, when they asked, when the president brought the new president, President Fox brought the director of Infonavit, and he asked him, how the housing stock could be increased. Actually, the task he was given is, the only thing you have to do is to build more houses than the former president did. So it's actually it goes back to the issue of scale. It doesn't relate to producing cities, or to any kind of territorial or urbanistic understanding of cities, but actually just to applying mortgages. If you apply mortgages, you're more concerned with financial returns than with any kind of urbanistic return on investment. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the city, the house of the 1940s transition into a demographic of the 1970s and 80s, and it's clearly still moving to a smaller household demographic. But keep in mind that even last year, there were 650,000 weddings in Mexico, which means that every year, and taking into account that not all of these people move out from their parents' home, a similar number of new houses is needed just to satisfy this demographic transition. This really becomes a task again that, unless it is similarly faced with sort of the tasks of urbanism at large, it's bound to fall. And finally, and this is extremely relevant of what has happened in the last 10 years, a combination of factors, but very much related to this ex-urban growth in the 1990s and the 2000s. 25% of the homes built in the last 10 years are abandoned. So imagine a housing stock of 2 million homes, in which 500,000 homes are abandoned. And actually, when in surveys, recent surveys in this past year and actually the last 2 years, show that the single most important reason for the abandonment of housing is location. So when you do, and let me go quickly back, when you produce this city, the only task, when you actually liberalize the market is concerned with returns on investment. So how would you produce housing for the workers, housing for the lower classes? You would have to reduce the land cost to its minimum. How do you do that? Moving out into the peripheries. So a perverse lack in the strategic understanding of subsidies, the absolute retreat from the state into the understanding of housing and urbanism meant that the 650,000 houses were produced every year, but they were produced 40, 50, or 60 kilometers away from the jobs, from the services, and from cities in general. What happens when we live 40 minutes away from the city? That sooner rather than later, you figure out that it's not worth to spend 3 hours of your time each way commuting. It's not worth to spend 30% of your earnings in paying for transportation. So there's an abandonment of housing, and people return to other formats, such as renting inside the city, which puts into crisis this other model, which is the idea of ownership. And this, we discussed this earlier during the reviews, but the whole notion, in the same fashion that the family arrangements enter into crisis due to socio-demographic changes. I was once fascinated to read that in Berlin, 50% of the households are single-person households. This actually produces, unless you're able to read that and turn it into an effective housing policy, you're bound to replicate mistakes that other places have done. And this is the case of Mexico City. An absolute lack of reading the demographics, an absolute lack of not reading how these decisions to cite housing states would mean for the city. And finally, just last year, September 2013, the perfect storm, Ingrid and Manuel, two hurricanes that hit the coastline of Guerrero and many other states in the Mexican Pacific coast, and they become our equivalent of a Sandy to New York City. It brings for the first time the discussion that risk and resilience in cities does matter. This is actually, and the tragedy about this is that, not this one of the photographs I'm gonna show, it's a housing state that in 2001 received the National Housing Award, the highest recognition for a housing project in the nation. So this talks about absolutely a failure in understanding how housing operates vis-a-vis urbanization. And this is the framework in which we're operating. And I will show through our personal professional practice how we've engaged, how we've begun to change the conversation with some of the stakeholders and some of the actors of producing the city, namely developers, the sort of the villains of this of this movie. If there's one thing I forgot to say that that relates to the sort of environmental and the resilience crisis of cities and housing in general, is the fact that the three largest home builders in the nation, actually home builders which had public companies, some of them which listed in the New York Stock Exchange, collapsed. They had their own tiny bubble. This is also remarkable. These are home builders that each of them build more than 40, 50,000 housing units a year. But key to their failure is two aspects. On the one hand, understanding that housing, and especially the finance of housing, is a high-risk enterprise. So the moment that they, similar to the US in some fashion, they understand that they would have to be more aggressive in terms of land acquisition, in terms of feeding a, a pipeline of housing production, they were lagging in many things. This is the fact that this is one of the developments built by some of these corporations gone bust is emblematic of a lack of disconnect with the realities of a system that was bound to go bankrupt. At least in 1973, with the origins of Infonavit, there was sort of an assumption that the policy, that the state could provide all housing in a very vertical fashion, as it was with Bani, became, if not completely horizontal, at least fairly more horizontal. It became a task of the state to understand and develop a policy of subsidies and a policy of housing construction. This did not happen for the private developers. So in a few years back, I think it was 5 years ago, literally in an elevator conversation with one of the leading directors of one of these large companies, we start discussing architecture and we start discussing cities. And we actually lay out in 2 minutes the idea of what good city planning meant. And I put this in an almost trite fashion, like saying, okay, mixed use, density, occupation, mobility, community, flexibility, and cityness, and at the end, sustainability. And we do the elevator pitch to this guy in this almost classic textbook 101 of good city planning. And the thing of the matter, he falls for it. He says, oh, really? Well, let's take a look at what you can do. And this is a developer that builds, again, 25,000 units. It's now actually the largest developer because the 3 leading companies went bust. So, and this is a company that actually remained a little bit more conservative in terms of financial strategies, and a company that became more interested in starting understanding housing as part of city sort of inner cities. In a way, we were doing our own kind of politics with the developers. They say that again, Deleuze says that with a rock you can break a window or you can build a wall. And we found that there's moments and there's conversations in which it's important to break windows, to be radical. And again, this is something that we discussed during the reviews today. And there are moments in which it's important to build walls. You get a rock, and now what can you do with it? So we imagined that that moment, problematic at first, could be the moment to start building walls. And we did this not by sort of turning into financiers or not by becoming politicians, but actually understanding that architecture is a form of politics, and that architecture and urban design is a form of becoming a financier. And we did this through architecture, namely architectural morphology and typology. So we start working with the premise that if we're not able to match the return on investment that a pro forma for a developer has, we're unable to even enter the room and enter that conversation. So the minimum ground, literally the ground, the place where we have to begin that conversation has to be at the level, can we not only produce a better, at least the same return on investment, but can we actually produce some kind of urbanistic community or sustainability plus value to a project? And this was our starting point. So this guy asked us to look, first of all, he asked us to begin selecting sites with him, which is also a crucial matter. Rather than focusing on just getting the cheap land, this guy, kind of an enlightened guy within a corporation, finds that, okay, it's not about actually the cheap land versus the expensive land, but how you can produce a system in which the financial understanding of the model of housing provision could be done in a more efficient way. Basically, for a developer, they're not concerned, they're not against building in the inner city. They're actually against losing 1, 2, or 3 points in their return on investments. So we said, maybe there's a way out. There's a way of finding through location a model in which by selling faster, by providing other amenities, you can gain a competitive advantage. So he asked us to look at sites, do quick scenarios such as the ones you're seeing here, like, okay, what's the capacity of a site? What would you do here? What can happen here? And we came in very quick exercise, like saying, this is an exercise in which you can leave 47% of the site open, you can have 780 units, and complying with every single regulation, you can produce so many units of housing under so many different typologies. And of course, we kind of manage risks. So if you see this one, it's clearly more, let's say, radical than a traditional system of blocks. But by showing these scenarios, we start, and that's the first part, which has to do with urban morphology. But by also showing that, let's say, different from Pani in 1961, 1963, it is possible, and there's a market ripe enough for multiple demographics and hence different housing typologies. We could move and start developing anything from the small 28-meter studio to the 61 square meters. That's the maximum size for social housing in Mexico. And the only way to actually make these things work is to connect it to that sort of Excel table on the right. How can you produce added value working through the extreme sort of regulations of a system that produces housing as a financial enterprise? So even the decisions of distance and size of rooms, but also the structural system of such a unit becomes emblematic in how we approach reducing construction costs and finding other assets in a project. The first project, which I already showed in 2012, is this Iztacalco project, 1.5 hectares, a post-industrial site located next to there's a subway line less than 1 kilometer away, and there's a BRT, a bus rapid transit system, less than 150 meters. So this is crucial. And we actually, kind of a hypothesis, we started telling our client, there's a market for people who will value living close to public transportation more than they value having a small, useless private garden. So we come to actually indicators of density. This has 500 units per hectare, which is actually, this is only 5 stories high. But in this evolution of scenarios, it allowed us to sort of present evidence and then jointly take a risk, sort of a leap of faith, to see whether our ideas, our kind of theories of what makes good urban housing could actually have a sort of a mirror in the market. And of course, the new adventures of all the urbanization is going back to the block, to the idea that a housing block can produce certain affects, both in terms of public and private, but also in terms of sustainability, privacy, publicity, which are relevant. In 2012, actually a few months after I lectured here, we won the National Housing Award for this project, and it has to. It's actually, for us, it's quite enlightening, because it's a project in which the virtues happen through different channels that just simply, let's say, architectural innovation. In a way, it's quite discrete. It's 5 ideas which we were able to convey, first to client, second to market, and finally to authorities. First of all, it's about the public space and this relationship between the public and the private. It's unless we're able to construct community, which some of the gated communities of the 90s and 2000s weren't able to do, we're bound to produce housing as just a financial enterprise. Second, it's about diversity in typology. 750 units, close to 9 different typologies, small variations in size, but which show that a market demands more than developers are sometimes used to catering. Third of all, make the parking disappear. There's no parking reductions in these housing projects. We're unable by law to provide less than a single parking space for housing units, which is dramatic. This is a place where the motorization rate is less than 300 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. It shows that it's not even a market match. We're overproducing parking spaces, which means that what do you have if you have to provide a parking space? The moment that someone, even if you don't have a car, if you buy the property, you will start thinking about the car. And it's dramatic, but we need to comply with it. The thing that we can do is to make it less relevant. And if you compare the pictures I show you, the honest-looking pictures in which, due to costs, everyone was putting doing surface parking, it meant that public life, community, pedestrian public life, disappeared to the cars. So the cars go underneath, which meant also a saving in terms of foundation, because this being a 5-story high building means that you could compensate, do a sort of a foundation to put the parking in, and means actually savings for the developer. And this is a project that it was 6 blocks developed over 3 stages. It started selling so quickly that they had to do it like one continuous single stage. The fourth idea has to do with the ground floor retail, which is on the eastern 2 blocks. There's 15 small units of mom and pop shops, retail, which again, within the corporation, we were asked, this will never sell. We're a business of doing housing, not doing retail. Of course, you put a small shop, and they sold like this. So now every single development they're doing, they are producing ground floor retail. And this is, I show these images, these are by Moritz Bernoulli. They're images of the way that some of the units have been occupied. And it shows, if I told you this is social housing, this is housing which is less than 35,000 pounds, roughly. 64 square meters, 35,000 pounds, more or less. And there's a kind of aspirational aspect to it. This is clearly not the low-end housing that we tend to associate with social housing. And in this sense, because these are, again, cross-ventilated, every single apartment faces the 2 directions, the exteriors and the interiors. we believe, forms of community building which do not necessarily happen in other housing typologies. And after the success of this project, and when I say success, again, for us, it's kind of a very understated recognition, both the price, more important, the fact that the developer called us back. I said, do you know what? I'm starting to buy larger lots, same model, less than 450 meters away from public transportation, places where the land still wasn't as expensive, but places where there could be some form of densification. We're not talking high-rise, we're not even talking mid-rise, we're talking 4- and 5-story courtyard and block units where we can achieve over 450 and 500 units per hectare. And so we do the schemes in the same fashion. And we try to, again, convey the scenarios. What are the risks? We think that home builders by nature are conservative, and it's reasonable to be conservative, especially publicly traded companies. They have a responsibility to stockholders, which go beyond a communication or a rapport with architects. If architects are, again, able to sort of get beyond this narcissism of we're not heard of, it's actually more that we're not hearing what's at stake. But scenarios allow us to provide how we can jointly manage the risks and how can we innovate. I'm sorry, there's a, here it is. So in this other project in Iztapalapa, it's a 5-courtyard project. This is close to 500 units. And actually, if you look at the early courtyards from the first project I showed you, it shows that they did nothing on the landscaping and the courtyard. So our project of landscaping, which had to do with vegetation, with programming for different kind of seasons, one of the courtyards was for young kids, the other one was more for adolescents. In a classic developer's fashion, they completely ignored us and they said, no, we'll leave the courtyards as empty. Now, in the second project, because they do surveys and research after selling, they find out that the single most important reason that people answer why they bought that project instead of the competition has to do with the public space. So it's a recognition that the forms of what people value are less in the idea of a private garden, but maybe other forms of association. And this is where architects we tend to have a role. So in this second project, actually the landscaping will be built. I mean, the guys came up to us and say, well, you know what? It's more important we tend to value, and this is getting built as we speak. I'm sorry, so this is in Iztapalapa, and again, no frills. For us, it's actually quite basic to learn to pick our battles. Where can innovation happen? Where our sort of added value or a grain of salt can contribute to producing a different model of housing. And just to win this battle for us, it's fundamental. The third project is in Colonia Doctores. This actually, if you look, is also next to a metrobus, a subway station, and a BRT corridor along this line. So it has become like a formula for them to actually see that the developer is now looking for these transport-oriented land purchases. For us, it's a remarkable win. It's actually that maybe if they had followed the status quo, something different would have happened. And again, it's a similar model, focusing on those 5 strategies: hide the parking, produce public space, create different typologies, find ways, do retail on the ground floor, and find ways for community to be built in another fashion. And this is actually a site with 3 fronts, a large front, the one facing the high-speed road, and then a complex relationship in terms of land, in terms of property limits. So again, the model is how do we produce these spaces, which again, and this is, to give you an idea, they started construction, I don't know if 6 months back, maybe less than this, and they've sold 90%. These are pictures from a month ago, and I'll show you some pictures which are more recent. they've sold 98% of the units at a time where less than 30% of the construction has taken place. This for them is absolute bliss. You can imagine if selling a home is a financial operation and not a protocol of urbanization, for them, the faster they sell, the more money they make. And and I say this, let's say, with zero cynicism. I mean it, that the way that we can return a conversation about urbanity and production of more effective housing and urbanization policies has to do with playing that minimum field. It's like stepping into Wimbledon. You at least must be able to not do double fault every time you're serving. And I think that the partial success of these projects has to do with raising the bar a little bit and engaging a key stakeholder. After the third project, we've actually been, what's remarkable for us is that even at the level of the industry, home builders are looking to the successes of ARA. This is our client, and they're actually beginning to replicate the model. It's not that we were the first nor the only, we just happened to be in the right place in the right time to engage in a conversation with a key player. And now even authorities, both at the federal level and at the local level, are looking and learning for the process. And actually, the Ministry of the Secretary of City Planning has actually asked us to present how these new models could produce better urban housing. So these are a view of the images of the construction site. So, I mean, it's in a way, especially here in Europe, it's a little bit almost irresponsible to say that there's a level of innovation here. But in the context of Mexico and in this 50-year history of production of housing, and in a place where over 650,000 mortgages will be applied every year, out of which close to half a million of those will be new housing, to engage in that conversation is crucial. And for us, maybe if you look at this and compare it to the first one in Iztacalco, there's moments in which we could be tempted to say that we're sort of pumping up the volume a little bit in terms of architecture, and it's in tiny battles that have to do with iconography. But again, for us, the urbanistic assets that these projects have are more important than even the kind of anonymous, almost I was going to say mediocre, but not mediocre, but like a kind of a bland architecture that shows. For example, in this was the first time that we tried two typologies, what we call the duplex, which is a unit. It's a 60 square meter unit, but that gets developed over two stories. Which originally the developers were very hesitant to look at. I mean, they said, no, if people want a house, they will buy a house in the peripheries. And we said, no, I think you're wrong. People want the best of both worlds. These were the first units that went just like this. I mean, even before the first foundation was put in the ground, those units had sold. And the second unit that got sold really quickly is a tiny studio, the 28 square meter studio. And it's beginning to show developers that if they take some risks, they might get returns. I know my minute 47, I'll take 10 more minutes. The third project for us is also remarkable because we've gone to the next stage, which is to actually use the system as a mode of negotiating with authorities, to present our ideas that urban housing can allow for land use changes and even for political mediation in the context of complex urban dynamics. This is the area of Atlampa, an industrial site very close to the historic center of Mexico City. This is Avenida Insurgentes. Again, same condition. There's a suburban train line here that goes to the peripheries of Mexico City. There's a subway line here, and there's a BRT line, actually one here and another one here. And this is a site in which we're asked to do a project where there's an old factory, an early 20th century factory, which belongs to, it's actually national heritage. So in a classical developer's fashion, they say, you know, we have to find a way to demolish the building so that we can do as many units as a business requires in order to purchase the land. So we tell the developer, same client, what if we're able to produce the same amount of units and we preserve the factory and we do something different and we use the existence of the factory and the remains of the factory as an asset to the project. And they tell us, well, that's not going to be possible with the current authority. So we put ourselves in the situation of lawyers presenting, rather than having what we call a gestor, which is kind of a broker, which tend to be somewhere in between lobbyists and technicians that do with the change and land use permissions. We put forward the proposition that to the client that if we're able to convince them to preserve the capacity of density in preserving the factory, it would be like a win-win-win situation. And this would, like I said, it's a early 20th century building, actually with some very nice moments, especially in the interior. Has a wooden structure with a major section here, and then a series of skylights facing north. So in a sense, we're sort of wrapping around, we're building courtyards, and then we're extruding. But to actually see how this gets processed and how we communicate to authorities, this is literally the presentation that we did for the city planning chief. And we said, okay, under current regulations, this is what you could do, which takes us to preserving at least 40% of open space and building a number of units. But what if we're able to use the potential, which is not in regulation, it's kind of absurd, but it's not in regulation, to be able to use the potential that the space over the factory has and to transfer it to the top of other building. It would mean a 9 and 8 story block. But if on top of that we use it in negotiation, we scale down and have a sort of a recognition. It's almost like a classic architectural maneuver. What do you do in the context of national heritage? But we get them to 346 new housings, which is 50 more housings that they originally planned. And we do 20 rehab units on the peripheries of the existing factory. And we do 20 new spaces for retail and workshops. So the client tells us, and of course the same issues about parking underneath and things like that I won't repeat. But this is literally the scheme that when we presented to authorities, they said, this is fantastic. We don't get developers who are able to do that. It's usually like a zero-sum game. What we lose, they win, or vice versa. And the city planning authorities are approved of this situation. The land use change is under process, and this hopefully by the end of the year we'll be building this. But in my mind, it goes beyond, again, a traditional understanding of how do we visualize housing vis-a-vis the city. It's actually about understanding that architecture requires, at the same time, a diplomacy and forms of negotiation in spheres where we don't usually tend to operate. Of course, it would be nice to have some of these units which will reuse this. Again, to talk about this in Europe, it's almost like embarrassing. I mean, you do this all the time. But in the context of us in Mexico, it's really the battles that we are putting our all energy. A second developer calls us, and now they see the success of that first developer, and we're developing a project for a developer called Marca Urbana, much tighter site, but the same model of privilege. You're able to give more public space because at the end of the day, you'll be able to capture that in the context of faster sales and better construction projects. Basement, 2 courtyards facing the exterior, facing the inner courtyards. And again, little by little, we're sort of producing, if not more interesting, but at least, let's say, an architecture in which we feel more at ease in terms of showing in architecture schools. And these are just the renders of. But again, this is not only a model of housing; it's a model and an understanding of urbanity. It means that actually if you think of the advertising I showed you with a girl not able to walk out, it's a mediation between this sort of semi-public space of the housing state, where you can have some form of city building and community building beyond what I called refrigerator magnet urbanism, which means where you have every single magnet to call for cigarettes, pizza, the milk, or karate lessons. You do not need to go out to the city, and hence it's a collapse of urbanity as we know it. And finally, I like to show the last aspect we're working on. This is a project that Saidi Springle, my wife and partner, she got a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts in Mexico, and she developed a project called Norm and Exception. And we're actually looking at the way that land regulations, building codes, state and federal codes are actually the straitjacket that's producing a particular kind of urbanity. It's actually don't get mad at the lawyers, get even in a way, and uncover the processes by which all these regulations get played out and mean that these things take place when you codify height, levels of a building versus height, when you codify the coefficient of occupation or the FAR, when you regulate minimum dimensions, which is, as we know, sometimes actually quite stupid, because in the sense of habitability, they actually are unable to read that maybe actually someone rather live in a 25 square meter unit because they're alone, they work at home, or they don't use, or they're barely at home, and they don't want to pay more to live farther away from the city. So to expose these things, and we've actually been in negotiation with people writing these laws, you do a kind of lobby, a light lobby, to say some of these regulations are actually the hindrance for better urban housing. Change the code and you change the city. Change the code and you change the way that you produce city. And the project has to do. I mean, yesterday I had the fortune to go to the Stamford Bridge and to watch the Chelsea Man U game. And the most amazing thing, this is the Aztec Stadium in Mexico City. Just look at the amount of parking around this Aztec Stadium. And what's amazing about Stamford Bridge is that not a single parking space. It's an infrastructure placed in the city, related to the city, which means that when you don't have parking, people don't go by car, and people get to a place in a different fashion. And this series of incentives and disincentives matter in the way we produce housing. This is the Aztec Stadium with all its parking. This is a BRT line across Insurgentes. But 10 years ago, and even to this days remain, the parking regulations, which means that this building has to produce 5 stories below and 5 stories on top. A third of its height is dedicated to parking. The current, actually, the most interesting thing about parking, which is the most radical, let's say, anti-urban regulation, just a single word in the code would mean that instead of saying minimum parking, you should change the word to maximum parking. And then let the market decide what's the best way to produce housing. But these are obstacles which we need to change in the context of planning policy and regulations. I think, I'm not sure if this is the last one. I end with this because to bring back the discussion of how housing can be literally the Trojan horse in producing better cities, we have to assume the complexities that both the city is not a house, or is not the large house, it's not just the accumulation of houses, it's not the numerical amount of housing, but actually the city is the accumulation of regimes and planning protocols, from legal to regulatory, from construction to financial. And unless if we are, as architects, as urbanists, are able to engage those multiple facets of the production of city, we will not be able to either produce better housing, but even worse, to produce, not able to produce better cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, next time you come to London, I will take you to a stadium that has solved much better the problem of parking. It's much nicer architecturally, and where I think they play much better football. That is the Arsenal, obviously. Anyhow,
Even if I root for Chelsea and Jorge still invites me, I will be more than flattered.
Are you a Chelsea supporter? I didn't know you were a Chelsea supporter. I thought you went just for curiosity. Anyhow, okay. Questions, comments?
Well, thank you, Jose, for this very, very interesting question. I really liked your little side comments all the time about how you're saying this in Europe. Since, in fact, I mean, me practicing in Vienna, we are discussing exactly the same things. Even though we may say, and I may literally say so, that we are, of course, there's a history in Vienna of dense housing projects. We're discussing ground floor use, we're discussing precisely the same questions of changing the norms and qualifications that you need in order to get actually housing to a certain quality, maximum parking instead of minimum parking, etc. Where I want to get to, though, is that one level of urbanity, which I would be interested in how much you're able to discuss, that is the need for the public to not only make sure that there's social housing, but additional infrastructure like schools, like public transportation and so on, which is not yet solved with bringing the developer to a certain density and to a certain quality of the block itself. So what's the relationship of the developer's investment and return to public infrastructure? Is there, you know what am I asking?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In the transition, part of when I ended with that image of the hurricanes destroying half of a housing state, and especially destroying the infrastructure laid out less than 10 years or 12 years ago, the 2013 was a crucial moment at the policy level, because there's a complete reorganization of the institutional arrangements of federal policy vis-a-vis housing got completely challenged and reorganized. And actually a new ministry was founded, which is the Ministry for Agriculture, for a reason I will explain in a moment. Agriculture remains, urban development, and the territory. And agriculture remained because it's actually not agriculture, it's agrarian development. Agrarian development, urban development, and territory. And agrarian development is at the key of the transition of what used to be rural land to cities. And most of the cities of Mexican cities have grown in the former communal lands, the ejido lands. So this reorganization means that not only has it become a change of paradigm, but the new rules of the game have to be implemented. And that the developments I showed, these housing states in the periphery built by the home builders of the 1990s, it's not only a perverse and bankrupt model, but it's actually a model of extraction of resources, because the developers just arrived there. They provided their tiny local infrastructures, but they had nothing to do with the large-scale infrastructures, which at the end of the day make them far more expensive to actually build a 40 kilometers away, and then having to provide the services and the roads and bring the water and the sewage. At the end of the day, the state is offsetting the actual income that the sort of money that the developer is saving. So it's publicly taken losses. So part of the new regulations by the new SEDATU and the new Infonavit have to do that the schemes of incentives and regulations are far more strict. So for example, they establish a 2-year transition program so that the industry does not go bust. So by the end of this year, the new regulations will be in place. So if you're building housing out there, you will not, it's not that you will not be absolutely prohibited from doing that. It's just that you will not get a single subsidy, and the workers who are registered in Infonavit will not be able to access mortgage for those housings, which means that they will go the rules of the market. So it's actually quite interesting because finally the state is using their mandate to level the field. It's not a matter of whether you build there or not, but you actually pay the full costs of urbanizing in the peripheries. So the closer you build to the peripheries, the more you're in touch with other services, then you're bound to get more subsidies. Actually, the final end users will get more subsidies, the guy who buys your property. And because for you it's a financial business, it means that you'll probably be better off, well off.
But in fact, I'm asking one step further, because those who build closer to the city center and are closer to public infrastructure, this is what we're discussing, to make them take part in the payment for the infrastructure. You know, so not
Yeah,
only that you
it's not only your,
yeah.
yeah.
That are building outside, I'm sorry, but actually, what is the engagement of those who are taking advantage of existing infrastructure, building dense housing, and how is this advantage put into being, and this big discussion can be put into numbers of
Yeah.
all these years to be paid.
I'll give you an example precisely with these, actually with this last slide. We calculated as part of this research that the amount of parking that you need to put and the cost of that parking, even at surface parking or half a level down, for every 350 parking spaces that you have to put, you would be able to, that amount of money would pay for 1 kilometer of a BRT system. So we actually presented this to the city planning agency and say, if you have to build, in Mexico City, just to give an example, well, in the metropolitan area, 100,000 units get built every year. Roughly 60% of those is a formal market. This means that 60,000 units mean 60,000 parking spaces. Turn it down into a financial condition, it means that we will be able to build thousands of kilometers of BRT. It's not that there's no money. I mean, you know, the discussion, we're talking about housing, but the discussion of financing infrastructure is a whole realm in itself. But if you actually connect, and in a way that's what I want to get at, reconnect in more strategic fashion the project of urbanization, the construction of civitas and urbanism at large. Through housing, you can actually change the rules of the game. We're too soon to know how these new rules will play out, but at least we're making an effort. When I was talking about diplomacy and playing the equivalent of the lawyer, we're doing that so that even speaking in financial terms is not that way off. It's actually just shifting the way the policy works. And of course, there will be a transition. Okay, let's not do without the parking. Let's reduce the parking in half and use those resources for the public transportation and for the water and for the energy.
Okay, let's see. I think there was someone in the back. Who else, just a second, who else would like to make a comment or ask a question? So we have here two. Is there anyone else there? Okay, what I suggest is that then we have all the questions and then you do, okay? So.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think about self-built communities as a model for the evolution of the city? Because you said change the code. If you change the code, you change the city. But how do you envision it as a mode of living in the society?
You know, should we go with the other three questions?
Let's see. The other questions. Who else was asking? Yeah.
Just firstly, one comment on what Gabo was raising about this question of, in a way, a payback into the, if you're working more in the inner city, a model that we have here, which is based on a concept called planning gain, where the planning authority can negotiate a feedback from a development either to finance a school or to do other things as part of a direct transaction for permission, which is sort of worked in London fairly well in some places, but it's a difficult model. But the question I wanted to ask, I think it's extremely impressive that you've not only been able to shift the way in which the private housing investors can see the opportunities, and you've also been able to begin to have an impact on the decision makers and the regulations. What impact are you having on the architects and the urbanists in Mexico? Is it the beginning of a rethinking about what practice might be able to do in relation to the city? Because I think there's been a big missing part of Mexican architectural thinking that would relate back to these questions. Are you alone, or are there now increasing practices who are picking up this agenda?
Okay. Not only I'm not alone, I'm on a leash. Exactly, that's it.
Well, what I wanted to ask is, I see these projects that you're developing, and they seem to be not social housing, but rather, you know, housing for the middle classes. I'm from Mexico City, so I know the relationships. Plus, you've shown them, right, from the 90s, what you've shown, and then this. How is it that how is it that the financial system is working with this housing? Is it financial by Infonavit, or how's it working? Because for me, I see it, and I see it as something incredible, you know, still.
Okay. Should I try to? I spent the first, I'll start with the first one. After writing my doctoral dissertation, I spent the first 5 years trying to get beyond the notion of sort of being tagged as the informal guy, the guy who only dealt with informality. And for me, informality was always an excuse to look at another way that the architectural discipline and profession could think about certain topics. Things like flexibility, things as time, things as shifting hierarchies, how certain sort of fragmented investments produce different effects in the city. And I do think that the question, I'm sort of tired of the dichotomy of the formal-informal, and I think everyone is in a way, but I do think that the questions that, let's say, historically have been raised by the problem of informal urbanization still have if not a lesson, still have something to say vis-a-vis the profession. Of course, it's been approached in many different fashions by many different people, and in quite successful ways. And I would say even something as Aravena's notion of doing not a half a good house, but a really good half house. It's actually reorganizing the resources of flexibility vis-a-vis housing finance, which relates to the last question, which I will talk in a second. So I think, you know, it's funny, I showed it 2 years ago, a project for a BRT line that we designed in Ciudad Neza. And it's funny, after many years that you talk about a place like Ciudad Neza, someone finally says, you know, if this guy knows about Ciudad Neza, why don't we ask him to design a transportation corridor for Ciudad Neza? So it's the ways of the planning and the relationship between sort of the professional practice and the intellectual discourses are a mystery. I mean, they sometimes come back and kick you in the ass, and sometimes they knock on the door and ask you to think about them. So I do think that even to this day, for example, it's not evident from the pictures you saw, but during construction, most of these units, the central wall, the developer would be able to shift it or build it in case the market changed. So for example, within in the last project I showed, I think there's 12 typologies or 13 typologies. So some of those typologies, if it turns out that the market was beginning to ask for the two units plus a small studio, or rather for a larger master bedroom, then they would be able to adapt. So that notion of adaptability within that, let's say, hardcore, classic housing project, I think is a sort of a ghost from my interest in informality. Remind me, Hugo, it's a, well, first of all, it would be completely absurd to think that we are leaders or any kind of leading voices in this. We just happen to be part of a group of people that are thinking less cynically and in more strategic fashion about how to engage the forces of urbanization. The generation, let's say, architects who are, let's say, between 50 and 65, precisely because of the structural crisis of the 1980s, 1970s, and all the way to the 1990s, kind of developed an aversion. They developed a more conceptual interest in the city. I mean, they were fascinated with Rossi, but they clearly did not want to engage in the rules of the game, and clearly not with the stakeholders. So people like Javier Sanchez, who's one of the most talented architects in Mexico, think of people like Juan Pablo Massa, people like Derek Delekamp, they're now working with these agents, which maybe a few years ago would have been called the enemy. I mean, if Pani was calling the informal city the cancer, the architects of the 90s were calling the home builders and the authorities the enemy. So I think it relates to maybe kind of answers your question. And finally, right on target. I mean, the Infonavit model, the subsidy they do, actually is not they don't give out a subsidy, they give out the mortgage. The mortgage they give out is, the top is 350,000 pesos, which is 20,000 British pounds, roughly. Fobiste, which is the equivalent of Infonavit for the workers of the state workers, because they tend to have a better income, the average mortgage is for 550,000 pesos, roughly 30,000 pounds. The subsidies, the people in charge of giving out the subsidies is the National Housing Commission. The subsidies, the rules of the subsidy are changing. So now the guy doing a housing on the periphery that I showed earlier in the 90s could get the exact same subsidy that the guys purchasing one of our units got. Nowadays, the subsidy will be an incentive to produce better urban housing for the ones that need them the most. So the housings I am showing are 750,000 pesos, which are 30 minimum wages per day per month. That's a kind of the calculation, the cap they put on the maximum. 35,000 pounds. So that's a maximum that a home could cost to get access to this income. But there's a huge chunk of the population which need the 250,000 and 350,000 home. So the task, currently the poorest of the poor are being serviced by the informal. But actually, that in my mind is not necessarily, it has a perverse aspect to it, which is that even when you understand social housing as a social policy, you're privileging let's say the middle lower class, or the middle, not the middle to upper, but the middle and aspirational, the guys who have social mobility. So that's gonna change, hopefully, but still the market of informality is producing, I would say, better product, more flexibility, ability to finance and grow over time, to the poorest segments of society than the current housing system is. Whether that's going to change or not it remains to be seen. Apparently, the paradigm means that finally the state will address the poorest of the poor. But one more thing, keep in mind that the poorest of the poor do not live in cities, let's say in urban agglomerations.
A question on a different thing. You mentioned that you didn't want to discuss this question of the relation between plan and project. But you start your presentation with the argument that, in a sense, the urban and questions of the city were collapsed, you use that word, within the large scale heroic housing project. And Penny as a good example of that. It's interesting that you present that as a substitution to planning, but it was a moment when also heroic plans existed. So it was a moment when modernist planning was being very influential in cities such as Mexico City and throughout the world, but certainly in the developing world. So I don't know exactly what do you see as when the relation that existed then between those projects and the planning practice and its ambitions, which were not few at that time, and how you relate to the housing projects of today, such as yours, that have the urban ambition, but let's say perhaps it's not about collapsing the whole of the urban within the housing project, but that relationship between those projects and planning. How much has that changed? And what do you think is different today that makes it more possible, that articulation between plan and project?
I'm glad that you actually used the term practice planning, another project of planning. I have a thesis that some of these even heroic moments of planning were actually planning understood as a large architectural project. It's very much about the physical, it's very much architecture driven or spatially driven, and it has very little regards with the complexities of the planning practices, which requires to look at everything from norms and regulation to even processes of social participation. Hindsight is always 20/20. Social participation was non-existent in the 1950s. But I would say that even still, there would be a difference with the understanding of the planning practice. For reasons I explained, I argued earlier, 70s and 80s became like a huge, the gap between the planning practices and the architecture practice became incredible. I mean, even in architecture schools, the planners were these odd fellows with no respect and no, they even dressed differently. Really, I mean, in the at least the North American system, the planners were not even considered a part of the architecture schools. They remain under the same roof. In some places like UCLA, they even got kicked out to a different department. This crisis of how do you engage these two disciplines, I think nowadays it's almost corny to say the renaissance of planning, but at least a rise in an interest in urbanism, which helps mediate the tasks of architecture as it relates to urbanisms, but also the possibilities of urbanisms as it relates to space and physical design. From our little plateau, we're assuming that maybe in a narcissistic, arrogant way, that some of our projects about dense urban housing perform better. I will not say they look nicer, they're better. They perform better at the urbanistic level than some of the previous projects I showed in the peripheries of the city. So that sort of a non-ambitious or not too ambitious task for architecture to relate to urbanism, but also to a kind of urban planning to relate to architecture, is the way. I think it's more reformist than radical and revolutionary. The discussion of the urban project, again here in Europe, was clearly had such a more complex agenda than in the case of Mexico. One could not aspire to in the political, economical reality. So I do think that it goes back and forth. So an architecture more capable of engaging the dimensions of urban design and to engage into the possibilities of planning and urbanism will also be faced by changes in law, regulations, and planning ideas and practices, which tend to put design back in the forefront.
But would you say that, as opposed to this attempt of substituting planning through the project, nowadays the practice, at least some of those practices in terms of housing and housing projects, aim very explicitly at rethinking planning itself, influencing planning and urbanism? Would you say that? Would you say that that is
I would say
what's
so.
happening in Mexico, for
Yeah,
instance, at the moment, that there is a direct relationship to planning and an attempt to actually influence policies and planning?
I would say so. I'll give an example. The city planning agency organized, put together an advisory council. For the first time in ever, actually, they put a 50-person advisory council, which is a council on sustainable urban development. And they brought together at least half the crowd is people 40 or younger, or 45 or younger. And this means that to actually wanting to engage the different generation in the processes of planning, the fact that we're in the room and not outside or not throwing rocks at the windows is a kind of a strange victory or a reformist victory, which I think it's important not to downplay. Who knows? I think it's in 2 years that I come back, if I ever return. I hope to tell you more about this.
But just finally, I mean, there has been a radical redesigning of these policies now in the last, since the elections, practically.
Yes. 13 months.
Do you think that projects such as yours, similar projects, have influenced a lot that rethinking, or that came out of the minds of politicians or the heads of politicians? How was that?
No,
why that came about?
I think it's more, it's not cause and effect. It's actually a correlation of things happening at the same time. But I mentioned to you this in private, but Infonavit, the housing agency, signed an agreement with Harvard University to make this transition from the changing paradigm, which is already like well accepted in many of the institutions, even at the level of the market. Everyone's talking about dense cities and transport-oriented developments. The discourse has changed. How do you make that transition into implementation? How do you bring the other stakeholders together? I think is something that Infonavit is engaging these efforts. I've been asked to lead 2 of those efforts in the Harvard Infonavit initiative. I would not even dare to say that it has something to do, let's say, I would say that it marginally has something to do because of this. It gives us the ability to be double agents, to actually have to face the realities of a pro forma, but actually being able to sit down and share ideas about how to implement these changes in policy. So let's say I'm not that arrogant to say that it's because of us. I think there's a multi-factor realities that are producing these changes in many different voices. But I'm happy to be part of that.
The 25% of units that are empty must be also a factor, no?
Imagine you're a chef serving food and 1 out of 4 dishes get sent back uneaten. I mean, that it will be catastrophic for. Well, this is what has happened with the housing policies. And architects, urbanists, planners, developers are part of the blame as well. And so I think it's an interesting moment to see how this will play out, especially because of the issue of scale. When you have a deficit such as the one we have in Mexico in terms of housing units, but also when the requirement, just the sheer scale of producing 500,000 units a year, I always compare with Epstein Howard's this garden cities for 32,000 people. I mean, one of the key theoretical constructs of urbanization of the 20th century has a target of that population, and we move forward, and how do you, policy-wise, institutionally wise, technologically wise, professionally wise, engage in this task. We're happy to sort of jump in the ship and sometimes even try to steer the direction of it.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to stop unless there is any urgent question there. No? So thank you.
No, thank you very much.